Professional burnout is at an all-time high.
The NHS has been hit by several strikes this year, and both junior doctors and consultants are staging industrial action.
You only need to turn on the news to realise the magnitude of this problem. People are beginning to have enough. So how do we fix it? Well, I came across this book called The Big Leap by Hendricks, and he says that too many people are stuck in a job they enjoy doing, but they are never fully satisfied. The zone of excellence.
In the zone of excellence are the activities you do extremely well. You make a good living in your zone of excellence. The temptation is strong to remain there. It's where your own addiction to comfort wants you to stay. It's also where your family, friends, and organization want you to stay. You're reliable there, and you provide a steady supply of all the things that family, friends, and organizations thrive on. The problem is that a deep, sacred part of you will wither and die if you stay inside your zone of excellence.
What's the solution? Well, Gay suggests we transcend our upper limits and enter the zone of genius. But how? Today I'm joined with Laith Rawaf, an orthopaedic surgeon and clinical excellence lead at Inovus. We discuss his experiences with burnout, a guide to overcoming this burnout, transcending the barriers we often set ourselves, and how we can truly tap into our potential and enter this zone of genius.
Perfect.
I begin this episode by asking David to reflect on the moment he realized that his current career trajectory was not aligned with his inner core values. Please make sure you subscribe, and I hope you enjoy.
I started thinking about what this career meant to me and what my current trajectory meant to me. And in order to work out what was important to me in my life and my career, I had to sit down and figure out what my core values were. And core values, I think, could be determined or segmented as per inner and outer core values. I'd say the inner core values might be the ones that build you as a character, perhaps obsession and passion and drive and attention to detail, probity, all these kind of things. But I think the outer core values is what I was focusing on. And I wanted to spend a bit of time figuring out what it is that made me tick so that my next decision in terms of my career was focused and based on that. And I knew from the outset, having been in ITU for 10 months, not doing any surgery of any sort, my passion is orthopedics. I knew that surgery is my passion. It's going to be one of my core values. And I cannot deviate from that in any way, shape or form. And I started looking back at my history, looked at my CV actually, was one of the first places I looked at it. What was the thing that I kept doing throughout my CV? It was actually teaching. I realized that I loved education. Teaching people was my passion, whether it be family about things or whether it be friends, whether it be colleagues, whether it be at medical school. I was teaching anatomy and clinical skills, all sorts. And I realized, I think during med school actually, I think possibly because trying to learn, just simply learn that sheer amount of knowledge. Yeah. You can't just read it and absorb it. You've got to teach. And I think in that process of learning how to teach, I fell in love with it. And also, again, looking at my CV, I noticed these audits, all these quips, all these little moments of passion trying to change something. I was definitely an innovator. There was no doubt about that. And even outside of medicine, I'd created things, cables that would communicate with cars or solutions to mechanical problems for vehicles or even for the home, things like that. Just random stuff that I'd created for myself or sometimes that I'd sold, and realized that actually I'd suppressed a lot of that, having gone into the medical pathway. And one of the final things, and it was really clear to me from even medical school and having big boots to fill in my own family, I was an academic at heart. And so tying those all together, I realized that I had to find something that was going to fulfill all four of those outer core values. I think the way to think about what those core values mean is that they're the values that bring value to you and other people, not just about your personality or who you are.
I started off that question by asking you what your inner goals were, and then you led on to talking about your outer core values. And so my question to you is, what's the difference between the two?
I guess your inner goals will end up becoming your outer goals. But I think my inner core values were, I think, what makes you as a character. And I think I always do, whenever I interview, I always talk about what your core values are. And I'd like to hear more career-based core values and character-based core values. But I do feel the inner ones are related to you and your character and who you are as a person. This is just my opinion at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think obviously what happens inside ends up becoming outside anyway. You certainly manifest it through some pathway, but I think your inner goals will end up becoming your outer core values, and they're probably identical. I mean, it's a matter of definitions, really, isn't it? But what
Yeah.
the end goal is, if you take a step back from all the definitions, all the different types, inner, outer, core values versus goals, I think the aim of it is to figure out what direction you want to head in and think about what it is that you're aiming to become. Where do you see yourself at the end of your career? And how also would that career fit into your personal life? And what it is that you want to achieve for your personal life.
And the reason I specifically started off with that question, so the listeners can understand a little bit about your journey, your career reflection in those pivotal moments. And I wanted to bring you on the podcast because you specifically, firstly, had written a fantastic blog on the Peer website, which I'll be linking in the description, about the zone of genius. And it was based on Gay Hendricks' book, The Big Leap. And you spoke about these concepts, the concepts of incompetence, competence, excellence, and these zones that people are often struck in, and how they can almost break this upper limit and transcend the upper limits into the zone of genius. Let's elaborate on those zones for our listeners. What is the zone of incompetence? What is the zone of competence? And what is the zone of excellence?
So this is obviously Gay Hendricks' term that he's coined. He popularized it, basically. And by no means, these are not things that I've come up with. But when I read this book, it hit home. I was like, firstly, I should have been doing this years ago. And secondly, I'm going to do it now. And it actually helped me a little bit in my decision making at the time. And to be honest, there are so many books that kind of touch on this topic of what kind of ability you have, what functioning state you're currently in, and obviously the difference between the two. But to summarize as briefly as possible, the zone of incompetence is just somewhere where you're not happy working in this place, and you don't fully understand it, and you don't kind of enjoy it, to be honest. Hopefully you're not in that position. The zone of competence, you are good at it, but you just simply don't like it. You don't find fulfillment from it. And you also recognize that actually a lot of other people are also good at this thing. And then you've got the zone of excellence, which is, look, you're not just good at it, you're extremely good at it. It's the zone of excellence after all. It's taken you a long time to get there. Doctors perhaps sit in this zone quite a lot because of the amount of time and effort it's taken to get there. But there is something about it that you don't really, truly enjoy it. You don't have complete fulfillment. There is enjoyment and fulfillment, but it doesn't feel complete. There are still moments of doubt. It still feels like work or a chore, is how Gay Hendricks put it. And I think that's quite powerful, because although you're excellent at it, if it still feels like a chore, then it's not something you absolutely love, is it?
I'm interested in the zone of excellence because I think a lot of health professionals operate in this zone, as you mentioned, and being excellent at something is probably what a lot of people strive for, right? To be excellent is a nice word. And so there's somewhat of a juxtaposition to ask my next question, which is, at what point did you feel that you might be, quote unquote, trapped in this zone of excellence?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We're all driven and programmed to think that we have to be clinically excellent. Certainly my role at Inovus currently is called the Clinical Excellence Lead. I'm building the Clinical Excellence team. We have a responsibility to fulfill on that, don't we? There were multiple points at which I realized that I was potentially in this zone. I think one of the earliest points would have been during the clinical years at medical school, and seeing other F1s or doctors, junior doctors that were obviously supervising me, sometimes seeing them falter or not succeed because perhaps they were displaying too much, they were working too hard. Or certainly I saw an element of mediocrity being celebrated and excellence being punished in a way. Not just excellence, but just pure genius, I'd say. We're going to touch on that, I'm sure. But moments where I saw doctors go way above and beyond and it not interfere or affect any of the other work. And then either being piled with more work because they've been seen as someone who's efficient, or they would be berated for it. And I saw that a few times. I'm not going to mention any specific scenarios, but it sucked to see that. And that was one of the main reasons that during med school and foundation program, I just kicked my ass into gear and started taking USMLE exams, because I did electives out there and I saw completely the opposite scenario. There were people that were being celebrated for their excellence, for their top tier excellence, whether it's academic, whether it's the way they did a clerking, the way they presented a case, whatever it might be. And a lot of my clerkships were in orthopedic. And one thing about, and I'll directly relate this to orthopedics. One thing that you know, and we all know about orthopedic doctors in the UK, is that we're banterous. We like to have fun. We might not have been the top at med school. There's a typical kind of character. I've got to say I didn't quite fit into that. I do like to have fun, but I'm a little bit more academic, perhaps. I don't know. There are academic orthopedic surgeons. I'm not saying there aren't. Trying not to offend anyone here, but at the same time, we all know what orthopedics has a reputation for. There is a fracture, I must fix it. There's a famous video, along with all the connotations surrounding that, ortho bros, etc. You go over across the pond, your average orthopedic surgeon out there was top at high school, top at pre-med, top at med school, top at their USMLE step 1 score and step 2 score. They're a completely different breed. We were doing 5 a.m. breakfast, 6 a.m. ward rounds, full day of operating, and then we'd have a dinner together and there'd be a book club until 9:30 or 10 p.m. Then we'd have a good night drink and then go back to sleep. You're waking up 5-6 hours later and doing it all again into the weekend. Team no days off is woven into their attitude. I think that's a separate US culture thing. But specifically now back to orthopedics, you can see the drastic difference between the style of surgeon. And so that's what, and tying this all into what I was seeing on my clinical years, I was like, I've got to do something about this. I don't feel comfortable working in this environment, and I need to try and do something to go and work in a different environment. I really liked the US. So yeah, I started doing the exams. And I saw multiple times throughout my career. Yeah, I took the exams and I ended up continuing in the UK for personal reasons. And I started seeing these kind of like blocks throughout my career. I think my first ever block was during F1, where I'd automated what was a painful process that was taking out, like genuinely, probably about 4 to 6 man hours of foundation program time a day, where we were copying bloods from the computer system to every consultant's book for every patient across the four wards that we had. I decided to just implement this kind of slightly automated service or program or whatever that would just print everything. And I would staple in, I'd come back after lunch, it would all be printed after it just was pulling all the relevant hospital numbers from the Excel spreadsheet automatically. And then I'd staple them into the book. And I went off on the weekend, came back on the Monday, and it was like passive aggressive notices everywhere telling you to not print out the bloods and things like that. I'm just like, this is not right. It doesn't feel right to me to put time and energy in actually improving a system and then it being thrown in my face.
Why do you think so many health professionals operate and are comfortable operating in the zone of either competence or zone of excellence, where they're decent at what they do, but if they were to step out and stop doing what they do, another doctor or another med student in the same rat race is just going to come and replace them? And despite obviously the limitations and evident pitfalls of comfort addiction, why is it that so many people are comfortable with just being in those two zones?
There are so many books on this, ranging from career-based books to personal books to mental health to physical health. And I think we have a term in medicine, path of least resistance. We've been programmed. Look, I don't want to be speaking like I have a tinfoil hat on, but genuinely, I used to interview. I used to interview at med school for MMIs, right? The questions are designed in a way to find people that are slightly more malleable. Let's face it, right? People that display an element of flexibility, professional flexibility, but perhaps in a slightly toxic way, in that they're not going to be the ones that will be leaving the tunnel that is created before us. Med school is very cookie cutter. We come out the other side and we know our careers practically till we hit our grave. And so we have our blinkers on. We have the pathway created for us. And there is an element of peer pressure surrounding that. We're all competing within this tunnel as well for really silly things sometimes, like exposure in theaters or who got the higher exam mark or things like that. And on top of that, this is compounded by the sunken cost, or the fear of sunken cost of training, of doing med school, of maybe all the pre-med stuff that you had to do. I was a post-grad. And there's loads of other things. I did actually think about the answer to this question, and there are people that have financial considerations. The job stability and the security that being a clinician or a doctor provides is there. Okay, we can argue maybe there's bottlenecks in training and it might take years to become a consultant now, but there is always a job, relatively speaking. And on top of that, there's the professional identity that we all have. When you graduate, you become a doctor. Even becoming a mister for me was a bit confusing. The Americans don't do this, but I understand the history. I just think it is quite outdated. But even that process, I'm like, I've worked hard to be a doctor. Why should I become a mister again, even though I've taken more exams? What is success as well? What is success is very associated with your professional identity. And if you leave all that behind, then you perceive yourself as maybe being unsuccessful. And of course, there's a genuine passion that these people have for what they do despite all the pitfalls. It does take courage to escape the magnetism of the zone of excellence, is my summary.
The question I'm going to ask here is probably more philosophical rather than specifically related to healthcare, but the systems that are built want you to stay in the zone of excellence or the zone of competence. They don't want you to transcend these upper limits. And the book, The Big Leap by Hendricks, is all about transcending this upper limit. And so this next question is just about, why do you think the systems are built to want you to stay there?
That's a very interesting question. We could, there are memes on this, of that meme where you've got everyone that are skeletons walking in the same direction.
Yeah.
I must get a job. I must earn money. I must look after my family and whatever. I think, look, there are societal norms and there's no escaping them, really. We can't, as in there is escaping them, but as in there's no escaping their existence. We can't remove them. And they have to be there for a reason. I'm not saying everyone should go and quit their job tomorrow, but what I'm saying is that everyone should maybe, is their job and what they're doing right for them and their circumstances. And I think COVID brought that to light for so many people. We saw people shifting to working from home, being able to perform meetings remotely, being able to spend more time with family. People were selling up flats and moving to houses because they wanted gardens to be able to play with their kids, etc. This whole notion of actually putting myself and my family first became so apparent during COVID that I think hopefully the societal norms are changing. I know there are a number of corporate entities that are now trying to force people back into the offices almost full time, despite the evidence to the contrary that actually mental health improves, physical health improves, and actual work output improves. Yeah, very difficult question you've asked. Very interesting question you've asked there. I think we could go on all day about this, couldn't we?
The only reason I ask is because I think the first step is obviously that reflection, that realization. And not enough people do it to understand that they've hit that glass ceiling, that upper limit that Hendricks is talking about. And so the next step is obviously entering the zone of genius. And people talk about genius being something you're born with. But I inherently believe that everyone has the ability to enter the zone of genius. They just need to understand when it's time to push past, when they've hit that upper limit. So what is the zone of genius?
To quote Gay Hendricks directly, you are uniquely good at it and you absolutely love it. I think specifically drawing back to my own experiences, I can't pinpoint a single moment where that happened. There are, I'd say, and hopefully everyone can relate to this, there are multiple moments that people have where you're like, I'm good at this and I love it. And I think probably hobbies come to mind. For me, it's music. I love designing stuff as well. And there are these moments where I'm like, I just wish I could just keep doing this forever. And I think you probably touched on this in the last podcast with Azim. If I'd gone down the route of being a full-time musician and monetized it, I might have ended up hating it, ironically. And so that's why it's a hobby and that's why it's a vent for me. But I think specifically relating this back to like training and medicine in my career, I think some of those moments where I realized there was an upper limit and I was approaching it was when I was talking to mentors, talking to seniors and consultants and asking them about what their life was like. What did their life entail? And it's not just from what they've told me, not just from what I would observe whilst they were working, technically at the peak of their careers. I'd absorb all of that and I think this doesn't seem that attractive, actually. And perhaps that upper limit is not that enticing to me. There were moments where I was thinking, am I just being silly here? Am I being selfish? Do I think I'm better than them or whatever? And I had to reel myself in. I'm like, no, actually, I am witnessing a future that I'm probably going to become that doesn't look that appealing. That was an upper limit that I didn't want to become anymore, or at least not just become that, not just stop there. I think one of the hard hitting facts was that a lot of consultants, when they got older, and some very close to me, some of my very close mentors, were suddenly realizing at that peak of their career that actually their bodies were starting to prevent them from operating, and they had to reduce their hours. And they suddenly realized that actually their whole livelihood, their whole identity is dependent on their ability to function. And this happened to me, and I had an injury on my ulnar nerve, still numb actually. For a while I was in an ulnar claw, and I had to have surgery to reconnect the damn thing. And that moment for me was like, crap, am I going to be able to use my hand for surgery? And it's fine now, absolutely fine. But at the time I was thinking, but this is really terrifying. And actually I've got a really close friend of mine. He's a wine taster for a very big company. And we got chatting about this a while ago. And apparently his tongue is insured. I'm like, that makes sense.
No way.
Surgeons
Wow.
don't insure their hands or their back or their legs. We have to stand and walk around, especially in orthopedics, very heavy on the back. Those moments I realized there's a ceiling there. There's an upper limit. And perhaps I need to go and transcend beyond that. I realized that there is far more that I can give in terms of value to whatever it is around me, to people around me and entities around me, than just becoming a consultant. I know that sounds really mean to people that are consultants. That is a really long and arduous and highly professional situation to be in. But I believe there's more. There's even more that can be delivered. Maybe that's just my hunger and obsession.
The zone of genius is interesting because, as I mentioned, a lot of people think that to be a genius is something that you're inherently born with. You're either a genius or you're not. But you wrote this in your blog. Several factors come into play when you're in the zone. If you recognize any of these, perhaps you've already been there. And so number one is you are utilizing your talents, skills, and strengths together. Number two is time disappears when you're in the zone and it feels great. Number three is you find yourself adding value to yourself and the world around you. Number four, your innate abilities are being utilized rather than just your learned ones. And number five is you find ceaseless inspiration and flow. That's impactful, very impactful. And so number one is the awareness of hitting that upper limit and wanting to transcend. But the actual next step is getting to that point. And so tell me a little bit about how you navigated into the zone. What challenges did you face? What learnings can you impart to others to inspire them to make a similar realization and to shape their journey, the next part of their journey, the next part of their life around something that will bring them happiness?
Yeah, that's what you've described there. What I wrote was basically abridged versions of what I'd read directly from the book, and also read around the idea of this zone and the idea of finding what your innate abilities are. And I think one of the things that hit hardest was you're utilizing all your skills, your talents, your strengths all at the same time. And there are people that have very narrow sets of skills and strengths. I know a close friend of mine, he's excellent with numbers and he absolutely loves working with spreadsheets. He's a CFA, MFA on the side as it happens, and he's worked in the banking sector for over a decade, but he absolutely loves it. And he finds his zone of genius within that zone. But for other people, it might be multiple things. It might not just be one thing, i.e. numbers. It could be speaking. It could be working on products, building stuff. It could be actually delivering care and being there, getting your hands nitty gritty. It could be potentially even hiding in a dark room and coding a program. It could be a mixture of all those things. And I think the idea is that you find all those things that are really important to you, that you're really good at, and then finding something that utilizes all of them, I think will help you satisfy your true zone of genius. And then you get to that point where it's the last of the 5 points, which is you find ceaseless inspiration and flow. There are people I know that when they are in that zone, they are just tapping away. It doesn't matter what they're doing. Like Elliot, co-founder of Inovus Medical, I see him sometimes on a plane just typing away, even when there's turbulence, and he's just dealing with it because he's in the ceaseless inspiration and flow. He's been an inspiration to me. And even mentors in the past where I see them in their flow, it is a beautiful thing to watch, honestly. So I think getting there in terms of advice, I have to look back at what my experience was, and I've got to say I did feel very alone at the time. I was up against the status quo, and not everyone in my personal life was fully supportive. However, I've got to say, one of the things that really carried me through was drowning out noise, having support from my close ones, sitting down and actually just building kind of a method to the madness. So I had these kind of in my notes on my phone, these pros and cons of situation A, situation B. It could be jobs, it could be doing another exam or switching careers. And then combining them into basically SWOT analyses. And if I'd worked out objectively the direction that I feel I should go in, and I combined that with my gut instinct, I felt like I was going to be onto a winner. And I think this is something that we draw from the experience in training anyone semi-professional in any field, whether it be music or sport. These guys are not just super talented, but they also work hard at it. And I think part of that process in understanding how to get to that balance, you can't do that without building the right team around you. I did write about this in another peer article. You can have a look at it. It's about mentorship. And I talked about the team that you need to build around you. So, the right cheerleaders, but also the right kind of know people, truth tellers, the people that will open doors for you, people that help you negotiate, those kind of things. I think building that team is so crucial to help you understand what the balance is for you between gut instinct and objectivity. And at the end of the day, do what's right for you.
And taking this big leap that Gay Hendricks talks about, he mentions 4 questions that you need to ask yourself. So number 1 is what do you most love to do? Number 2 is for identifying work that you do that doesn't seem like work. Number 3 is what produces a high ration of abundance and satisfaction. Number 4 is what is my unique ability? And these are questions I actually did ask myself and reflected on myself prior to starting my podcast, where I was a little bit up in the air. What do I want to do with my life? I felt like I was very much stuck in the zone of excellence where, yes, I could have carried on in the path I felt like I was going on and been a great doctor, but I felt like I wanted to take that big leap and channel my inner creativity. But there's barriers, and there always will be barriers in entering that next step. And so what do you believe are the biggest barriers? Mine personally was this false belief, like that I am flawed, I wouldn't be good enough. And so let's address these barriers. What are the biggest barriers that prevent most people from entering the zone of genius?
There's a couple of things to think about here, and some are positive, some are negative, and I think some are neutral. I think one of the key things is we spoke about is comfort, right? It is very comfortable. But beyond that, I think I'd say that's a positive one. But a negative one, like you alluded to, is self-doubt. Perhaps that imposter syndrome that creeps in. I think we've all had imposter syndrome at some point, even in medicine, because you're put into these crazy scenarios where sometimes you're doing things without supervision that you're allowed to do, but you do double take. And you're like, the imposter syndrome can settle in. And I think you've got to find ways to work around that imposter syndrome. And certainly we'll go back to a positive one, perhaps perfectionism as well. A lot of people want to perfect what they do so badly, it ends up being their own enemy. There is that saying, perfection is the enemy of good. And perhaps that can tie into overcommitment. There are people that might have overcommitted to that zone of excellence. They can't leave that. And for a number of reasons, like we spoke about earlier, there might also be just this lack of awareness. They haven't thought about this. They've never sat and paused. And that's why I loved reading this book, because it highlighted this to me. And I've realized as I was reading, I was like, I've probably done this throughout my life at points where I've tried to figure out what it is that I love. But he put it in a way where you literally do it. You do these Venn diagrams like you described with the 4 questions, and you move the things that you love between those Venn diagrams until you get to hopefully some sort of conclusion. But one thing you've got to remove in that process, like I said, do what's right for you. So ignore any resistance to change by yourself or those around you. Ignore expectations from others. Doing it alone can sometimes be quite difficult in that I know he says go into a quiet space. Yes, you must do this alone. But what I mean is that don't just act on what you've done alone. Go and discuss that with other people, with mentors, people that you trust. Like I said, go and discuss it with your team. at the end of the day, it is a journey of self-discovery, personal growth. I think these things are about you at the end of the day. And like I've got to say, I've got to hammer it home. You have to do what's right for you. And sometimes you don't know what's right for you. So it is worth going through this process. And even if you get it wrong, it's okay, because then you're learning from that. As long as you do learn from it. But you learn from it and you go back to the drawing board and you're like, okay, so that didn't work out for me. We can now move that to the other Venn diagram and just look at it from that perspective, rather than, again, stressing and then going back into the zone of excellence because, I tried to I tried to transcend that. It didn't work out for me. It's probably because you just didn't go about it the right way, because it's your first time, and that's completely fine. No one, unless it's beginner's luck, most people don't get it right the first time. So I think having that honest conversation with yourself and just removing that self-doubt, I think will speak volumes for how you end up in your career.
And amongst all the pieces of advice in the book, I find this with a lot of self-help books that probably like 60% of what I read is not really relevant to me, not really useful for me. But then it's just that 30 to 40%, which is actually very useful to me. So out of all the advice that you read about, what resonated with you the most and why?
I did have to think about this question for a little bit. And I actually think it was the quiet part, sitting somewhere quiet and just drowning out the noise. Turn off your phone, maybe have a pen and paper as opposed to your laptop. But actually going through that process alone in a quiet room or in a quiet place, or for some people it might be somewhere actually loud and busy, like on a corner shop, a coffee shop, or on the corner somewhere where you see everything and there's a hustle and bustle. I think whatever it is that helps you find that area of peace, I think it's worth trying to focus on that. For me, that was great. I think just even those moments, as sometimes I get those moments when doing my hobbies, like music or exercising, where I just go into a zone where actually I do find some form of inner peace that I can try and work out and solve problems that are bothering me. And I think that's basically what he was describing. That definitely helped me a lot. My favorite question that he asked was, what work do I do that doesn't seem like work? And I think everyone's got to think about that. And hopefully everyone has something that they can answer with. And if not, then I'd say to all of you, go out and try things until you find that. And then just put your time and energy after going through the process into that thing.
It's fantastic advice. And just to end, I think it would be good to touch on why this conversation is specifically relevant amongst health professionals and health entrepreneurs, and some last pieces of advice for anyone who might have come to that realization, I might be stuck in the zone of excellence. What can I do to take charge of my career, take charge of my life?
I think specifically to healthcare and potentially even health tech, med tech, I think the zone of excellence has provided us a platform in order to enter the zone of genius within health tech, med tech. When I see these CEOs of huge, really run and successful med tech and health tech companies, a lot of them are in that zone because they had worked clinically and they probably found their own ceilings and their frustrations. And those frustrations probably came up with that idea. Their frustrations with a particular pain point or a problem probably led them down that path of testing a hypothesis and going through a creative process of coming up with a solution and then building that solution, then proving that solution and making money in terms of raising money and then building the solution properly, taking it further to a point where it's profitable. And I think we can't just look at the zone of excellence for health clinicians and beyond as being somewhere that we shouldn't or we don't want to be in. I actually think it could potentially be a place to be that will allow you to open up to a new zone that could be your genius. And I say this to a lot of people I mentor that are either looking to leave at the end of med school or looking to leave at the end of foundation or not even do foundation or whatever it might be, is that clinical work is so key to you finding out what's important to you and what makes you tick. What is it? What problem? There are so many problems within health services around the world. But what are the problems that you want to fix, that you're passionate about, that you can find ceaseless inspiration and type away applications to grants or to build decks late into the night for a pitch to the VC next morning at 6 a.m. or whatever it might be. The idea here is that I want you to embrace that zone of excellence and to think, actually, this could be the secret to unlocking what it is that I want to go and do eventually. And there will be programs that will help you structure that process. But I think nothing beats your own experience. And for you to subvert that and shortcut that, I would recommend against it. And actually, the good thing about that is that then you also get to continue your career a little bit in your standard traditional medical career. And I would say potentially even do both at the same time. I was doing both industry and clinical work for quite some time, until obviously it gets to a point where your industry work is large enough that you do need to put 100% into. But the benefit is that you're able to juggle both. You can operate in your zone of excellence 9 to 5, and then outside that window, you can operate in your zone of genius. And hopefully that provides immense fulfillment for you. But the idea, the summary of it is, don't feel like you need to escape that zone of excellence. Perhaps look at it in a slightly different way. Every day in that zone of excellence is an opportunity to see a problem that you could find a solution to.
David, it's been my pleasure having you on this podcast, and this has been such an insightful, super interesting conversation.
My pleasure. Honestly, I'm really glad you reached out. Thank you for having me on the podcast, and I celebrate your work. Just let me know what I can do to help you.